Welcome to the History Nerds and I podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. I don't normally do theme podcasts or kind of align with the time of year. Maybe that's a failure on my part, but a certain book popped up that is just perfect for Halloween called Cunning Folk by Tabitha Stanmore. And it answers a question that I never really thought to ask, which is, hey, we all know that kings and queens would sometimes have fortune tellers show up. Why weren't those people burned as witches? Because they weren't witches. They were something called Cunning Folk. And Tabitha's going to tell us all about it. So this is as close as I will get to a theme episode, people. I just don't do it. But I was excited to do this one, and it came out great. So I'm going to shut up. And here we are with author Tabitha Stanmore, Cunning Folk, Life in the Era of Practical Magic. Tabitha, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. Delightful to be here.
I think I should put it out. Like, I've read your book, but also you're Dr. Tabitha Stanmore. I didn't walk into an occult store and just say, hey, come on the podcast. You are a PhD. Your focus is in magic and witchcraft. I think everybody would like to know, how do you get to that point, right? Like, because I do think people think, oh, magic and witchcraft, you own an occult store and it looks like a hot topic from back in the 90s. How do you, as a very learned, intelligent person, end up with this type of focus?
I mean, I wish I was a throwback for the 90s. That sounds really fun. Yeah, so I should say it's definitely the history of magic and witchcraft. I don't study the current magical landscape or kind of current magical practice, which I guess kind of precludes me from having an occult shop, but you know, I'm open to it. Yeah, I came to it via history. I mean, I've always loved medieval, early modern history. I got ridiculously obsessed with the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings when I was about 10, and I didn't let that go for years. And then I went to university to do history as an undergrad, and I did my dissertation on male witchcraft because I was really interested in gender and belief and religion and the darker side of religion, which is things like persecuting witches. And I was really curious about sort of why people were scared of witchcraft, why it was persecuted so strongly, and also why we always focus on women. Maybe there's some men that, you know, we should be looking at as well. So I kind of got really into that. And then went on to do a PhD, which I thought was also going to be about male witches, until I realized there's actually way more magical stuff happening in the world than witchcraft. And so I thought, hang on a second, I haven't heard of that. Not many other people have heard of this either. Maybe we should be thinking about that and working out what it is. So that kind of led me down this path into magic and magical practice, and I haven't really left.
Well, thank goodness for us, because we got the book. I think it's so important to highlight because people can be dismissive once you say magic or anything like that. For instance, the 7-county witch hunt project is something that you're heavily kind of involved with because of your PhD. And you're talking about people who were clearly, you know, I don't think they were in league with the devil. And this is history. These are people that were wrongly persecuted. And somebody like you gets to remember them and tell their story. And that's important, whether or not you think magic is real, witchcraft, all that stuff. That story is important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. You know, I completely agree. That's one of the reasons I wanted to write Cunning Folk, was because I think, as you say, we tend to think of magic as being something which is a bit out there. It's on the fringes of society. It's not something that normal people, in brackets, care about. But what I realized was actually it's everywhere. And it's a very human thing to believe in something. And often that's magic, and sometimes it's witchcraft and all sorts of other things. And it's a disservice to history, and it's a disservice to our ancestors to not recognize that this is actually part of their society and culture. And yeah, I just think that's something is edited out of a lot of history, I think. And I think that's unfair.
You say it at least a couple of times in the book that you're not commenting on, do you believe in magic? Is magic real? It almost seems like within the book you're saying, that's not the point of what I'm doing here. Is that kind of the way you see it, that commenting on whether or not we should believe it is completely outside of what you're doing?
It's definitely outside of my remit to say whether people should or not. As I say, I'm a historian, and I think it's the responsibility of a historian to look at the evidence and try to piece together an accurate picture of the society or the time or the episode that they're interested in. So passing judgment on whether or not something definitely happened the way it's reported as happening isn't necessarily the case. And it's definitely not for me to say, you know, magic is real or magic isn't real, and they were all sort of deluded or wrong, because frankly, these are people who lived 400 years before I did, and they've decided what they saw. And it's not for me to tell them they didn't, as far as I'm concerned. Apart from anything else, they can't answer back.
All right, so let's talk about definitions. The book is called Cunning Folk. Who are cunning folk? Are they witches? What's their deal?
So, no, they're not witches. And if anybody ever wants to follow me on Twitter/X or whatever it's called now, my handle is Magic Not Witches. Because while doing my PhD and researching Cunning Folk, a lot of people said, when I said to them I'm researching magic, they go, oh, witchcraft. And I went, no, not witchcraft. Because the definition of a witch back then in the 1500s, 1600s, the definition of a witch is very different to what we would think of now. Now the word witch has a very broad category attached to it. It's somebody who, it could be an empowered woman. It could be somebody who practices herb law. It could be somebody who uses demons. It could be all sorts of different things. Whereas in the 16th, 17th centuries, or even earlier, the word witch had quite a specific meaning to it. And that was somebody who practiced dark magic. It was somebody who used their powers to do harm, often with the use or the help of demons, which is very different to cunning folk. Cunning folk, or I like the broader term service magician, they're people who did practice magic, but it normally wasn't to do harm. It was normally for practical purposes, like finding lost and stolen goods, or healing, or performing love spells and that kind of thing. And they were actually treated very differently by their society. And even in law, they were treated differently because they were seen as not witches. They were magical practitioners, but not the same as witches.
Well, that's what I loved. I hadn't kind of seen your book, and then it got sent to me, and I just looked at the summary and said, I love books that just the very premise of them makes me rethink something that I never thought through, which is witches. That's probably going to happen a lot. You watch a movie, you read something, you talk about, oh, there's fortune tellers, there's tarot, there's this, there's that. And in history, they were all over the place, and a king would go to them or someone else. I read the summary to this book and I said, yeah, why weren't they all burned at the stake? They're all witches. And this is the book that shows if you were on the right side of magic, then you were basically fine. Now, there might be a little bit of frowning upon it, but it's kind of like, oh, if you're a fortune teller, you're not getting rounded up and put on the pyre. It's a completely different thing back then.
Yeah, it really, really is. And I think it's really important, to make that distinction. As you say, it's not one that we make very often. Definitely not in things like fantasy and sci-fi, which I adore and I read a lot of, but it's definitely something that's witches and cunning folk and all sorts of other magical practitioners are definitely lumped into the same category a lot of the time. And Hollywood is also terrible for this. If you've got an attractive young woman who practices herb law, then of course she's going to get burned at the stake. But in reality, that just wasn't the case. In the late medieval, early modern periods, there's two different types of court that exist, kind of legal courts. There's the church courts, who are in charge of policing moral behavior and making sure that you're practicing Christianity right. And then there's the secular court, which are in charge of sort of physical crimes like murder and theft and that kind of thing. And up until the mid-16th century, neither of these courts really care all that much about magic. The church courts definitely care about it a bit more because it's seen as a moral crime to be moving away from the right preachings of priests and the right sort of practice of Christianity and relying on magic instead. So sometimes the church courts will get interested when you're sort of basically blaspheming or committing idolatry by doing magic. But generally they see that as a bit of a misdemeanor. So you'd get sort of re-educated, or they talk you through what is the right way to practice religion. Or you might be given some kind of penance, which could be something like, on the milder end of things, being asked to confess your sins in front of your congregation or something like that on a Sunday. So it's really not very heavily punished. And then you get into the 16th century and then the secular courts start getting interested in it. And that's partly because of witchcraft, because of the threat that some magic, some bad people trying to cause harm could, the threat that they could present. That's when you start seeing slightly more persecution of magic overall, but it is mostly focused on the magic that does harm. And if you're not doing harm, nobody really cares, as long as you're not causing problems.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this. Are you a cunning person in your spare time? Like, when we turn this off, are you going to create a love potion or anything? I just want to put it all out on the table. No, I'm not. As I say, I'm very open to the
belief in it. And I was sort of raised in a very, I suppose, unconventional way to completely believe that magic is real. But it's not something that I practice myself because honestly, it would interfere with my historical research. And I really like to be accurate and not have my opinions colored too much by my own experiences. So it would mess with my my ability to read the texts. So no.
Yeah, I know. I find it all very silly because I'm Catholic and I pray to Sky Daddy all the time. And that's completely different and very provable, unlike magic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I also love just how this book opens up. I think one of the strongest examples to open up a book and really kind of put somebody in the mindset of what you're trying to go for. Can you please tell me about A Woman and Her Spoons?
Yes, I can. So there was once a lady called Mabel Gray who lived in Westminster, just outside of the city of London. Westminster then being a suburb of London and not fully in London itself. And she lost some spoons. And she was very upset about this. We don't know a huge amount about the spoons. We don't know what they were made of. We don't know whether they had particular emotional significance to her, but we do know that she really, really cared about them. Because having looked all over the place for her spoons and going to find her neighbours to ask them whether they knew where they disappeared to, she couldn't find them anywhere. So her neighbours suggested that she go and find a cunning man who lived on the other side of the river. And he apparently would be able to identify where her spoons were. And she arrives at this cunning man's house and he says, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but I actually don't know where your spoons are because that's not the kind of magic that I specialise in." But he says, "Don't worry. I know a woman who lives not too far from here and maybe she'll be able to give you some advice." And then this woman says, "Oh, no, I'm sorry, I can't help you either. But I do know of a third cunning man who can help you." And so Mabel goes to 3 cunning people in a day and asks for advice from all of them, paying each one and crossing the Thames several times to kind of find all these different cunning folk until she eventually finds one who says, "Oh, yes, I can tell you exactly where your spoons are. They are where they've been hidden."
Thanks, buddy.
Yes. And we're not actually sure what happens next. We know that she spent an entire day looking for these things. We know that she consulted a lot of people, and we know that she did eventually get an answer from a cunning person about where the spoons had gone, although it was incredibly vague. I like to think that she did get them back, partly because she made it very, very obvious to everybody that she knew that she was going to go and consult a cunning person about where these spoons have gone. And the cunning person said very confidently that they would turn up where they had been left. That's either because this person had the magical skill to get the spoons to return to her house, or because everybody knew that Cunning Folk worked, their magic worked and was very effective. And so the thief of the spoons panicked and just shoved them through her window while Mabel Gray was out. But either way, that's the kind of everyday adventures that people would undergo to go and find a cunning person to help them with their everyday problems. And it's amazing how often missing spoons turns up as an issue that people want resolved. But that's because, spoons were really important. It sounds silly now, but, people didn't own many objects, and any object would be quite expensive to make, whether that's either in the resources that it was made from or the amount of time it would take to make them. So losing something like that could be a real problem for a normal person living in London at the time. And she didn't have many other people to ask. She'd asked her neighbours for help. They couldn't help her. She couldn't claim her spoons on insurance because that had barely been invented at that point, and certainly not for something like spoons. And the alternative was to try to get hold of some more, which would be more expensive in time and money than going and consulting these cunning folk. So that's what she ended up doing. I really like this case, and it's the one I kind of open the book with because it gives an insight into lots and lots of different problems and mindsets that were kind of existing in the early modern period, and the kind of problem solving that the methods of problem solving that people engaged in.
I think it's perfect to open it up. It really does. It sets you up for the time. It sets you up for the understanding. And then the fact that I think a lot of people would think there's one cunning person and you go to that person and that's the person for the village. But this poor woman is getting sent to various different ones. And you talk about it too. I have to think that as a historian, this technical aspect must drive you nuts. You don't get a lot of resolution for these stories because if the spoons show up, she's not going to go back or write it down. she's going to leave that cunning person, and that's the last thing you may hear of it, unless, you're talking about kings or queens and things like that. The documents are not going to be there for you, and that's got to drive you nuts, right?
Yeah, it really does. It's very frustrating. It's even more annoying because even with some cases that do involve kings and queens, as you say, we still have this really frustrating thing in historical records of the time that if something ended up going to court, then often the depositions and the informations and the kind of the evidence, basically, that would be recorded in one place. And then the outcome of a trial would be recorded on a little slip of paper that nobody cared about. So they're literally just kept in different places in the original sort of records room where the trial was happening. And then they're also kept in a different part of the archive. And often that is the part, well, the outcomes is the part of the archive that gets destroyed or just sort of jettisoned at some point in the last 400 years. So yeah, there are so many people I'd love to just go back in time and visit and be like, what happened next?
And if you're a cunning person, you're probably only going to end up in court if you suck at it. Because if you're good at it, no one's taking you to court. But if you're terrible at it, somebody might try and get their money back.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how we have any records of these people in general. Because as you say, if somebody's good at their job, people don't tend to write reviews about it, right? And you definitely don't take somebody to court in order to say, you're really good at this, thank you. Yeah, so we kind of, I had to do a lot of reading in the negative, I guess, to try to work out what was going on and how common magic was and what people were asking for, because it's often, as you say, the cases that go wrong that we actually have any kind of surviving record of. But I think the fact that they do crop up relatively regularly probably means that there were a lot more people practicing than we'll ever hear about, and a lot more people who were successful at it. And we do sometimes have positive stories coming through in the court records. Not often, but when they do turn up, it's normally something like a cunning person has been accused of fraud, for example, because one of their spells didn't work. And there's a lovely case from the 14th century where one man says, yes, okay, this spell didn't work. I'm really sorry about that. I will return the client's money. However, it's definitely worked in the past. I've been really, really good at finding stolen objects. I can give you examples, and he gives 2 examples of people in other parts of London that he's really helped. And then he also goes on to say what hours of the day he practices, possibly because there might be potential clients in the room who might want to use his services in the future.
No press is bad press, even back in the 13th century.
Exactly.
Now, I'm trying to think of an example of some of this cunning magic. And I'm trying to think of an example, maybe some sort of cheeky example from the book. Oh, I know. Can you tell me about buttocks bread? You knew I was going to ask. You knew it. Well,
it was either that or the fish, and I'm glad you went for buttocks bread, to be honest. So, buttocks bread is a charming little spell. It's a love spell where you're essentially trying to get somebody's attention. Say you've seen somebody in the street, you think they're absolutely gorgeous, but they're not giving you the eye at all. So what do? You could try going up and talking to them. If that doesn't work, then you could, try showing that you're a really great person in some way. And one way that you could do that is, for example, by making them a meal, or at least making them a nice sandwich. But if you're really keen on encouraging somebody to like you, and you don't think that your sandwich fillings are that good, you can make buttocks bread to go with it. And that is where you make some dough, you put it on a table, and then you use your buttocks to knead it. And this will transfer some of your essence, physical and spiritual, into the bread. You can sort of recite something at the same time, maybe a sort of a short poem, or some kind of incantation to encourage love between you and the object of your desire. And then once you finish kneading it with your bum, put it in the oven, you bake it, and then you feed it to your intended lover. And the idea is that through a sympathetic magical link, they will then absolutely adore you and not be able to stop thinking about you. This was common as far as we can tell. There's instances of it, I think, from the 15th century. It goes all the way up. I think it's recorded in some 19th century texts even, as a method that people were still using in the countryside in England to encourage love between two people who had fallen out of love, or to encourage new relationships. And sometimes also the buttocks bread would actually be shaped into the shape of a pair of buttocks.
Of course, yes.
So that you really, you just in case the message wasn't getting across that you like someone, you can just really put that in their minds.
It's almost kind of a butt selfie for back in the day.
Yeah, that is not something that occurred to me, but yeah, let's go with that.
If I had a top 5 list of people from history that I could meet, I'd have to think that in that top 5, I would want to meet whoever it was that came up with buttocks bread the first time. Right? Was it somebody playing a trick on somebody? Was it someone who really felt that this was going to work? I have a feeling I want to hang out with that person and hear some of their other ideas because it's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. Although I think one of the first questions is, how often do you wash? I would ask.
Yes. Yeah. No, there would definitely be tons of questions. What are some famous examples? So if someone's really trying hard and can't conceptualize what we're asking and talking about here, what are some famous examples of where cunning folk show up in history that almost anybody would know?
So I think most people have probably heard of Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, the person who Virginia is named after. She employed cunning folk, and quite a few of them by the looks of it across her life. I think the most famous person that she probably ever employed was John Dee, Dr. John Dee, who would have seen himself as a mathematician and a polymath and a navigator. He published actually a very extensive book about sort of navigation and how to get over to the Americas and explore sort of the coastline very in a lot of detail. But he was also a magician, and that's probably what he's most remembered for now. He summoned angels, he summoned demons, he used all kinds of different magical rituals to identify where gold was buried across the country. And Elizabeth used him as a diviner, so to tell the future. He drew up a horoscope of her coronation day to let her know whether or not she was going to have a successful reign. Somewhat predictably, he said that it would be a very successful reign, it would be very long, but also it turned out to be true, so that's good. And he also offered to be able to find her all of the gold mines in England using his magical skills and potentially even turn base metals into gold, which was very useful for Elizabeth because she was going through a real problem with inflation at the time and currency adulteration. So I love Elizabeth. I love John Dee, partly because he was a cheeky sod who was definitely always looking out for as much money as he could possibly make through his magical powers. But also because Elizabeth, she really did invest in a lot of magicians and a lot of astrologers and a lot of alchemists. And she even employed a female alchemist to help her try to work out her inflation problem and to get more sort of gold into the system. We think of Elizabeth as being a person who lived at the kind of the gateway of the modern era, and in many ways she was. But she was also somebody who was very interested in magic and did dabble in it, and certainly employed magicians to solve all sorts of different problems. So, yeah, she's a very iconic, I suppose, image of what the relationship between a normal person and a magician could be like in the 16th century.
I think very often people would think, oh, it seems silly now about all of these cunning folk, but they're still here. You drive down a highway, there's a tarot reader, there's a palm reader, horoscopes. It's all still here. This is not something that's really gone away. Their advertising might be a little bit different, but I always wonder, if you're a cunning person back in the day, how often do you need to be right to be considered good, right? If you're right 1 out of 10 times, is that good enough? Does it need to be 2 or 3 times? What defined success back in the day? I think it's an interesting question.
That is a great question, and I wish I knew the answer, to be honest. It's not something that's very easy to tell, because most of the time we only have kind of trial records or something like that where things are going wrong, or we have occasional grimoires and spell books actually that survive, which, list all sorts of different spells, but we don't have a tally of how often they worked. And as we know, sometimes even a very successful cunning person could still be brought to trial for failing in one case. So it's hard to say, but we do know that a lot of cunning folk were trading on their reputations. That was the most important thing. Obviously, this is before advertising in any way that we would really recognize it. It's before something like the Yellow Pages or the internet. So it was word of mouth that people were using to kind of get their business known about. So being good at your job was really, really important, no matter what industry you're in. And when it came to magic, I'd say it was even more important. It could vary according to what the client was asking for as well. So if you're asking for something really, really big that you think is kind of cheeky and unlikely to happen, for example, something that cunning folk were asked about occasionally was finding a missing person. And so a cunning person could be very cagey about that and be like, you know what, this person's been missing for a while. I can't guarantee they're going to come back. I can tell you their last known location, for example, but I can't tell you whether they are alive or dead or anything like that. So cunning people could be quite honest about, the limitations of their own powers, and people wouldn't necessarily hold that against them if they got it wrong or if they weren't able to give a good answer. So in some ways, I guess, actually honesty is the best policy when it comes to cunning magic. But I think also the more that people practiced it, the better at it they would become, especially if you were a cunning person who was very adept at healing. If you've seen 100, 200 sick people in your lifetime, then you've probably got quite a good idea of whether or not somebody's going to survive and whether or not your method of healing is going to help them. So you would pick and choose your cases partly based on that. I mean, there's no reason why a cunning person has to accept a case. So they probably would be quite careful about what they thought they could do and not overpromising. Unless you're somebody who travels around the country and then can just promise the world, take a fee, offer a spell that doesn't work, and then disappear the next day.
Well, of course, and then we can't forget, we're talking mostly about benevolent cunning folk as far as we know, but there's, of course, the ones that like to put their finger on the scale and say, perhaps they steal the spoons so that the person will come pay you to find the spoons, and then you make sure the spoons get back there. So we also have to find that other, more malevolent side of the cunning folk as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this isn't a direct comparison, but I sometimes think of cunning folk as a bit like financial advisors, say, in that they are people who offer a service that a lot of people appreciate and that they need, and they can give relatively reliable forecasts of what's going to happen in the future. But they're not always right, and they're playing with quite tricky forces that not everybody understands that you can't really control. But also there are some rogue ones out there who are just going to take all your money. And that doesn't mean that in general the industry isn't one that is, sort of quite carefully managed. But in some cases you get real, really bad people as well. And you get the same thing with, I guess, medicine, or even, priests in the 16th century. You had some really good ones who were really, really pious, and then you had some who just wanted the free income, the easily gained income, who weren't trustworthy at all. So yeah, it's very much kind of personality thing as much as an industry thing.
If I could send you back in time so you can talk to one person that was in your book, who would it be? So there are so many choices, so many options. I know it's a terrible question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You have to answer it. It's a terrible question. So I'm going to go a bit left field, because although I'd love to go and talk to all sorts of interesting monarchs and things, I think I would go back and talk to a man called William Wycherley. He was investigated for magic use in the 1540s when magic wasn't a secular crime, and he gives the most detailed, lengthy confession I think I've ever seen. He talks about his 25-year career of practicing magic and trying to find buried treasure all over the place by summoning demons and summoning ghosts. He talks about all of his accomplices. Accomplices probably isn't the right word, but his fellow magicians. He gives the addresses of them. He says who he's borrowed books from. And I don't know why. I don't know why he went into this much detail. Nobody really asked him to. We're just sort of asking about one individual case of magic, and he just goes off on one and doesn't stop talking. And I'd love to know, firstly, can I have his address book to go and meet all of his other cunning folk friends? But also, why did he go into so much detail? I just need to know. Listen, I think that's a perfect choice. I love it. My last question, there are people who think history is boring. And there are also people who think, magic is ridiculous, right? Now, you and I both know these people are just misguided souls who just don't understand. But if I sat one of them in front of you and they said, this doesn't make any sense, why should I read Cunning Folk? What would you say?
I would say that you'll learn a lot more about yourself and the world you currently live in than you expect. And also, there are some diverse uses for fish that you would never expect. And the only way you're going to learn about them is if you read this book.
That's good. Because I know exactly what you're talking about, and we're not going to talk about it. You're going to have to read the book, everybody. Tabitha, thank you so much. The book is fantastic. I appreciate you coming on to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Tabitha, thank you so much. Cunning Folks, super fun book, people. Get it for the person who loves Halloween in your life. Trust me, they'll get a little magic, they'll get a little history, they won't know what's going on, but they'll love it. Hit us up, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.